So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sakina, for inviting me to be with you today. I'm very excited to be here and share a little bit of the research that we've been conducting over some time, and especially to do so within an Australian context. I'll say I travel quite a bit and work with quite a few institutions around the world, and I think the work that's being conducted in Australia is really leading edge of the entire globe. From what I have seen in the way people are thinking around analytics, and especially thinking in kind of fundamental discovery ways, but also in ways that can make this analytics, make these insights really useful to help and improve student learning. I get very excited. I get invited to come, asked to come, commanded to come maybe once a year. Not really commanded, you can say no. We have a teaching and learning event that's held, and it's a very exciting opportunity for me. So fresh off that, I'm happy to be here today and share some of these results with you. And now it works. That's really good. Otherwise, I would have danced for quite a lot longer. So I'm going to do a couple things today. I'm going to talk about, just give you a quick overview of learning analytics, a little bit about how we think about it, how I think about it personally, and how we're taking this into our work at Blackboard, in case you're not familiar with learning analytics, to kind of give you a sense of how we locate it. And then talk about three research findings that we've had over the past several years that have led to our current thinking, and I think could give insights maybe useful to you about how to think about, use, apply, and in some cases how not to apply analytics in understanding student and faculty kind of behaviors and experiences. And then have time for conversation at the end, I hope. So the three studies there are listed, and you'll see them in just a second. So this is way too long. We were just talking about when people do really long introductions to themselves, and that's not what I'm going to do. There's a number of bullet points here, just trying to give you a sense of who I am. And the biggest thing is that I come, just to give you a sense, that I come from a higher education background. So I spent about 15 years running large-scale academic technology systems for some of the largest systems of higher education in the United States. Small systems like the California State University system, 478,000 students and 23 campuses, and they're doing things in a coordinated way. So thinking about deploying and how we use these technologies really led me to realize that we had tremendous data that we were collecting that could give us insights. We spent a lot of time, you all spend a lot of time, a lot of money, right, a lot of student time using academic technologies and tracing behaviors, and thought that data would be a tremendous source that we could use to better understand learning and to better intervene and get involved with improving student learning. So that actually is, and I've been involved in multiple communities, and I'm not going to read this because it's, but you get a sense of what I really wanted to know is this: we have this behavioral data, right? One of the challenges I always had is we'd send surveys out to campus, asking them about their LMS or their VLE or their academic technology, and our response rate, if 20%, was really good. We had a sense that that was not a representative sample, right? That wasn't giving us everyone's insights, and we're collecting how this is used at pretty deep ways and thinking there must be something we can do about that. So I was working with Cal State, with Blackboard. They were collecting a large scale. They'd begun a Hadoop big data database. They came to me and said, well, what 10 questions? We're doing all this work. We have all these developers, programmers. What should we do with this data? What questions would you ask of it? Right? And I said, well, here's 10 questions. It's the most exciting thing, right, as an educational researcher, is to get told we have too much data, we don't know what to ask, right? It's kind of like a dream come true. I gave 10 questions. They came back. They said, well, we can answer a couple of those. We need to do some other work. Do you have some more questions? And before I knew it, I was working for Blackboard. And so that's the work I do there, and I've been working there about 3 years, is doing the large-scale data research. And so I have responsibilities with some product teams. They come to me and my team. We now have a team of data scientists that do research. They sometimes think up their own ideas and say, hey, wouldn't this be cool? And we go to people running products and see if that's something they would be interested in, and do research to get those findings and insights integrated. So that's kind of a little bit about where I come from and what we do. And I'm going to share a little bit more kind of about that. So thinking about this presentation for you, right, thinking why might this matter? So I told you a little bit about my background. Here are some ways I think this presentation might be useful to you, or you could turn on your email. And I'll keep making bad jokes, by the way, throughout, so don't worry. That you might be interested or find some useful. So first, I think to kind of get an understanding of what the potential is around this data that's coming out of the LMS, and how it can help you understand student learning and maybe the success of your courses, and give you insights to figure out some approaches that might be able to help with your students. And then I'll make some connections to talk to you and show you some of the ways briefly that we're incorporating this into the applications that you're using, that you will see now, and if you go and request access for your course analytics, some of these are things you will see there. So this is a bit of what's behind that. This is the thing our lawyers make us put up every time, because sometimes we say things and show insights that may come true in different ways, or we may get better ideas. So I created this thinking about learning analytics and kind of where it fits into broader sense of assessment, and came up with this pyramid that's kind of like a Maslowian pyramid, hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that. And we rarely, and I think this is what we're, of course, want to be at the apex of the pyramid, right, to be the most kind of actualized, I think. But to simplify learning analytics to some degree, where it fits in, I think at the bottom, right, there's this question when you're assessing technology is, does it work, right? Can people get to the site, right? That's the first and most important thing. And we guarantee that with service level agreements on the tech side. You have those with vendors or other people you work with, right? If it doesn't work, nobody can get to it, it doesn't matter, right? We can go home, right? The second thing is, are people using it, right? If you've built a course site, are people, are faculty coming to it, right? How many people request access to analytics, right? How many people want to use it? If you set something up for students, how many of them are actually engaging with it and using it on a regular basis? If people don't use it, we kind of have a pretty good sense it's not going to make a difference or have an impact. That's actually often, those measures of adoption can be pretty difficult to figure out, right? In a way that's kind of meaningful and authentic. But at the end of the day, that doesn't answer the most important question, excuse me, which is, does this make a difference, right? So again, we invest this money, these time, we put these tools into place. Do they kind of move the needle on student learning? Do they make a difference, and particularly for students who are most at risk, students who are first in family to attend college, perhaps? I once worked with a professor of online who is teaching language at UC Davis. I live in Davis, California, and he said he developed a lot of tools, and he said there's a lot of my students that I just have to get out of their way, right? They're going to succeed with or without me, right? It doesn't make that big of a difference what I do. He said, I'm developing these tools, and they're not the most important people to me. The important ones are the ones that will struggle, the ones that have a hard time. That's who I really care about, and I want to make sure what I do makes an impact on. So that also, right, within learning analytics, it impact student learning, right, for particular populations who stand to benefit the most. So distinguishing learning analytics, there's long traditions of research, right? Long traditions of educational research, of psychological research, but learning analytics positions itself a little differently. And here are two definitions that I like that point out the distinction of learning analytics from other types of research as a body really that's at the nexus of research and praxis, right? Of practice and praxis. So here is the first one from ELI. You can see here, no surprise, right? Collection and analysis of usage data associated with learning. And really it's the focus here, and we added this, the boldface, to enable appropriate interventions, right? To some degree, you have to understand the data and the insights we're collecting, but at the end of the day, the purpose is not, I hate to put the just, right? The purpose is to enable insight so we can do something about it, right? And we can enable interventions and make a change. And the LAK, Learning and Knowledge Analytics Conference, came up with, I think, a definition, same year, but often more cited. I use this one a little more, And it has this distinction here about learners and their context of learning. So this idea of focusing on the immediate context in which learning takes place, not doing post hoc learning. One other person in the analytics area said much of educational research is autopsy analysis, right? So it's going in and kind of diagnosing people who have, already left the building, right? That's not particularly, again, it's helpful and useful, but much more helpful to do it with people who are currently in the institution who we can do something about, and still understanding, and they have this optimizing learning. I'm not so fond of the word optimizing, perhaps, but it's a generalized idea. So that's kind of a distinction of how learning analytics fits in. So getting closer to what we do, so we have multiple big data sources. We have more data than I think we can actually meaningfully analyze. So some of our key data sources we have, as you'd guess, Blackboard Learn is the largest data source that we access. The new version of Learn, it's in a SaaS environment. We've actually, that's come aboard since I've been with Blackboard. We've done intentional instrumentation with that. So that we do that around learning at a deeper level. So begin thinking, one of the things that was a surprise to me, I will say, coming aboard with Blackboard, is that the servers do record everything that the server does, but sometimes they don't record everything we want to know about what students do in the precise ways we would like to measure it. That has to be done intentionally. So we've been doing that, for example, in Learn SaaS. We've instrumented differently things that represent active learning from a student. And, again, I'm aware I'm in an audience with people with more training in psychology and maybe educational research than I have. But thinking about passive versus active is kind of a crude distinction, right? Reading a post versus posting a discussion forum post, submitting an assessment, these kind of active behaviors, and being able to aggregate that and do that intentionally is a significant effort in making sure we have data and data sources that can do so. I'd also say we are also making this data available to you. There's a commitment from Blackboard to provide out this data in formats without charging people, because it's your data and your students. So we're making that more available. We have other applications as well. Blackboard Collaborate, a web conferencing tool, Plan, Predict. So we have a number of data sources that we can take a look at, and really these are three high-level techniques that we use, right? So the first is a simulation. So before building features, sometimes we have people that say, well, what would happen if we provided this feature, right? And so we do simulations. If we created, for example, a trigger to notify students if their activity fell below a certain level, how many students would get notified? And we created a rule. We used best research, best kind of the research out there. We used what we had as good kind of hypothesis. And we created this rule and a trigger, and then we ran it on historical data, and we found out we would notify students with one ultra important alert message every single day. Each student would get a message saying, super important, look at this, right? And which is not helpful to get an urgent alert every day. We would get kind of notification fatigue. So we're able to go back and tune what we use to come up with results that are much more reasonable before things go into practice. Hypothesis testing, and that's what we'll look at most of today. We can look for specific relationships, like what's the relationship at scale between time students spend in a course and their grade, and then data mining, which is kind of the most exciting thing, because you look for, I have here fancy words, latent patterns in data. So we don't even know what the patterns are, but we're looking for some of those associations that exist, and then thinking about what those mean. So for example, and we'll talk about this today, what are the typical patterns of the way faculty use tools in Blackboard courses, right, to look at these kind of patterns. So these are the kind of things, the kind of ways we approach doing our analysis. So questions, I mentioned some of these a little bit before. So the bigger questions we look at is, how are people using our platform, students and faculty, and how is that related to student achievement, right? What we care about at the end of the day is students learning and doing so effectively, maybe even efficiently. So how is that related? And this is a proxy usually for grade, because that's what we can look at scale. But we work with many institutions who say our students are successful all the time. We have institutions that have very high pass rates. They want to look at things like student satisfaction, student sense of connection to an institution as well. So there are other things like that we can take a look at. I mentioned earlier, have a personal commitment, and we have a commitment to looking at students called at promise instead of at risk, right? At promise, because they have the promise to fundamentally transform and do much better. So looking at that, especially students who are disadvantaged by societal characteristics, things that happen to them before they come into study, and then seeing how we can integrate that to make a difference. Over the past year, we've been thinking much more deeply about integrating analytics findings as kind of a core part of the things that we do. So it's not analytics separate from, right, the kind of tools you get and the tools you use are things that are embedded and integrated. One thing we've found that to be kind of a true by definition is that faculty are not looking for new tools within the LMS or other academic technologies, right? Say, oh, look, there's a new analytics area, submenu 3, right? Now, that's never come up, right? So instead, right, thinking about how we can embed these into workflows. So with that kind of last word around this, I think this is the last word around kind of general statements that we're very aware and are sensitive to privacy and regional jurisdictions and differences around the world, and then also have a commitment to sharing the results of what we do, right? We see this and the research and the data science that we do is something we want to share openly to help benefit the field, and frankly, we like to share it so that you can take this and you can do the next version of this research as well. Look at some of the things we find at scale are interesting, but they're kind of like an unfocused picture because we don't have the context you have from teaching courses, from knowing your students, right? So that you can take these general findings and help focus research studies that can really get more precision around the learning outcomes and the dynamics at play. All right, so that's section 1. So any questions actually, and so can ask me. So I'm happy to take kind of questions for clarification at any time, and hopefully we could have a broader conversation toward the end. But is that any questions at this point? Clarifications, concerns around this? Is this what you thought learning analytics is? Does this make sense? Okay. All right, so let's look. So one of the challenges that we're, so I'm working at Blackboard, looking for these relationships we can apply and integrate. The first thing we began with, right, is looking at what is the relationship between just general use of learn, frequency of learn, and student outcomes. So I have this in the beginning slide. We were conducting single course research. This is my doctoral dissertation research. I studied one class, Introduction to Religious Studies at Chico State. Serves a very large distributed region in California. And it had the largest use of learn for that whole campus that year. It was also, this class was just redesigned to use and be in a hybrid mode. And the question was, what's the relationship between use of learn in this course and grade? And so you can see here, scatter plot, and kind of the trend line goes up pretty well. We found a variance that we could attribute to use of learn, and it's in about, and these are R-square values that are translated. So just of LMS use is a R-square of 0.23. It explains 23% of the variance in student grade, which is relatively low for something in terms of the research we've been able to do subsequently. We're finding rates of 80 and 90% actually that we're able to get up. And we found some variation between different types of use of learn and student achievement as well. And the more important thing, I think, that we found, and I found this in multiple subsequent studies, is that LMS use is always a better predictor of student achievement in the course than their socioeconomic or background factors. This is a little hard to read unless you have really hawk-like vision. So this is the R-square value of independent variables plotted. The red ones are the ones that are background and demographic. The blue ones, I think this is blue, I'm a little colorblind, are LMS usage. So, and this is first in family to attend college with this group was the lowest of them. And then you get up to high school GPA, and that's the highest of those demographic variables, right? If you get good grades in high school, you're likely to get good grades in college, right? Why you got good grades, we have no idea, right? That data doesn't give you that information, but it's a decent prediction. We looked at race and class as well, right? But all of these coming in, right, are static variables, often set at birth or maybe set one time, right? They don't give you a sense of the variance going into a class. This right here is the frequency of students checking the announcements in Learn. This was actually WebCT Vista, right? The frequency of checking announcements is a better predictor of course level outcome than is student high school GPA, right? That kind of finding is something that I've gotten in every study I've done, right? And it is, and I'll also be clear here, right? I like to do a lot of, that's why I titled this falsifications, right, is one of the first things. And that is not causal, right? That is not because like students reading announcements are just suddenly, magically transported and, engaged or something like that. It's not a causal relationship, right? It's because it's an indicator, right? These variables at this level are proxy indicators, right? They indicate a kind of effort, a kind of will, maybe an interest of that student to participate in that class. And again, I know that's probably not rocket science to folks here, but important to say, we're not kind of trying to pretend you just need to get students to check this, right? There's something behind that we would like to uncover. But again, this kind of behavioral data, to me, this is the foundational piece here about learning analytics, especially at the course level. It gives us deeper insights to students than we have otherwise. So I should have taken a picture of Brisbane and put that here, but that would be funner. But the question, so that's interesting about that class. We've done it in a couple of other classes, and we find similar results. We're getting, some nice findings. But what about all the other classes? What happens when we do this at scale? Scale this out to all classes in an institution or a lot of classes in institutions. I'll cut to the chase. It's a little different, right, as you might guess. So we looked at this here. So this is a scatter plot again. There's a few more dots on this one. So what's the relationship between student use of Learn and grade? And we looked at the number of, I think this was clicks, I believe. And you can see here we looked at the student course level, one student, one course with a grade. This is 1.2 million students and 35,000 courses at about 800 institutions. And there was, so again, there's a statistically significant relationship, as you can see from this trend, right? A lot of low use, a lot of grades kind of right here. So actually the intercept gave us a lot of the predictive power, but it's sloping up, but it's a really low effect size, right? The amount of impact that it had was tremendously low. We filtered this data to look at courses that had, I think, above 60 minutes of use, had grades that were between 0 and 100. It's really interesting when you look at Learn at scale, there's a lot of classes that have like 350,000% for grade. There's some really interesting grading schemes that are there. So we filtered these down to reasonable courses, but found in the effect in the actual, in the power of the variables was something like every 60 minutes students spent extra in Learn would increase their final grade by about 0.5%. So at scale, not differentiating it led to very low results because we don't have access to contextual information. Just looking at this broadly, right? And if you just take the one thing we did with one class and generalize it out, we're not finding those same results. This was a sad day, I will admit, right? We had a party that said the death of the clickometer, right? In a sense. This was my data scientist, I will say. I have Sasha Dietrichson as a head data scientist. He's a quantitative linguist, and he said, "You're really surprised about that?" And I said, "Yeah, I was hoping," and he said, no. But he's a linguist, right? So he's like, it's all in the words. So, but then what we did find, so we did that again. We actually relativized that to courses, and we did a number of things, but still didn't come up with overall findings. So we did again, we ran, and this is kind of straightforward. We did a multivariate, we did a analysis and looked at the relationship between student use of Learn and their grade for each of those 35,000 courses, right? So I just say, thank goodness for, virtual clouds and servers, right? They could crank through, right, 35,000 regressions. And for each one, we looked at what was the R-squared value, what was the coefficient showing the power, the relationship between use of Learn and grade. And what we found in this density plot is that that is highly variable. There's a big range between them. And this comes over, right, it's around probably, in the 20s, right, 22, 23% of those that had a significant relationship. So we found about 22% of the classes had a significant relationship. In those that we had, there was a variation in quite a range between them. And again, there's quite a bit here. It probably tops off around 20. But it goes all the way up to near 100, but not quite. And thinking about this, right, this is one of those things people have repeated on campuses. We're looking at large scale, all the courses that are active for a certain period of time. So our results, right, again, it's that unfocused camera, are going to be not as good as the ones you could get on a campus, because you can filter down to what are the actual teaching courses, what are educationally relevant. At scale, right, we're getting results that I think are a little bit lower, but probably indicative of the kind of results you would get at most campuses. So the question, right? So this is the sad day. So learning analytics is the falsification. Thinking of this data as always a strong indicator is not true, right? We simply know that it's not true. It's not going to be useful in every single case. That said, right? Why are some stronger and some weaker? And what data can we use to help us better understand that? This is where things, I think, get really interesting and get more kind of relevant for you all to take to the next level. So one of them we looked at is, well, I think in part of it we knew, right? It's not just that you use Learn, it's the way that people use Learn, right? It's the kind of tools that students engage with, and maybe the relationship between them is a little different. So we did another study. This study was looking at the specific tools used. So again, here's our research question, relationship between student use of Learn and their grade based on the tool used. And so what we did was we filtered courses with potential meaningful use. And here's some of the criteria: more than 60 minutes on average, enrollment between 10 and 500 students. You guys call that a medium-sized course in Australia, I think, but in North America we call that big. Gradebook used, and the grades within a reasonable average range. We found the most frequently used tools within Learn, and then we separated students into their tool use, into quartiles. So no use and 4 quartiles of use. Bottom 25%, 26 to 50, above average, you get it. 51 to 75 and up the highest level. And then we divided students into 3 grade groups. So we looked at students that got basically high grades, students that got passing grades, 60 to 79, and students that failed the class at 0 to 59, assuming that's a failing grade. This ended us up by doing these filters with a little over 500,000 students and 18,000, about 19,000 courses. And here's the tools used in Learn by their frequency of use. So these are the ones we looked at the most. Guess what this one is? Can't see it. What do you think? Course content, that's right. What do you think the second one is? That's the bigger one. Assessment. That's right. What about the next one? Any guess? Did you guys read this already? Cheaters. Next time I'm going to cover it up better. I just suddenly got that idea, right? All right, we'll work on that for next. Note to self. And I'll also note one other thing to you. Don't look at that. Just kidding. I mentioned this joke about faculty and are not looking for this tool buried under submenu 3, right? They're not looking for this other tool. If you can see this, here's the retention center. People familiar with that tool? You guys are using Learn 9.1, right? So Learn 9.1 has a retention center built in where you can track individual students. You can set rules and get notifications and track students over time. Right? It's not turned on? Oh. Well, even if it was turned on, all right, well, maybe it's not just because people don't want it. But this to a point, 0.0001% of the usage was retention center. Right? And some of that has to do with the filtering. We looked at this with faculty as well. We have to unclick, because I keep on looking at this pie chart of overall use. It just demonstrates to me the need to integrate these kind of features and functionality, right? Because it's just very low usage for a multitude of reasons. I don't want to, but anyway, side point. So here is the result. So I'm going to show these in order of kind of interestingness, not the frequency of use. So here's the result of doing this analysis by my grades. Every class had grades, had to have grades. Didn't say how many grades it had to have. What you see here is at increasing levels, the dots are the size of the dot is the number of students within that, right? And then the trend line, green is good grades, yellow is okay grades, and red is bad grades. Here's the quartile of use, right? So here's, if you don't use the grades, right, you could still get a good grade, your likelihood, because the grades, again, are biased towards high grades. But at every quartile of use with grades, student likelihood to get a good grade goes up, right? Students who are looking at their grades and paying attention to assessment are more likely to be getting good grades. Again, is this causal? No. My 15-year-old son really wishes that was true. He keeps on looking at his grades, and they say no study. He's study, and then there is a causal relationship there. He's getting it now, actually. He's doing better at studying and not looking at his grades. Grades haven't come out yet. We just started. Anyway. So is it a good indicator? Yes. Should we give grades to students who aren't looking for them? Right? I think so, right? And this is something we're actually building in. So one of the more interesting things, actually go back quick, before I show you the next thing. The other really interesting thing, right? This is the only tool that relationship is true for. This increasing relationship is true. All the other ones have different patterns. You might think to yourself, what is that pattern? So here's one, course content. If you don't look at content at all, again, remember, large-scale aggregate courses, they may not have a lot of content in them. This looks different when you filter by that. Students who don't look at content versus those who do at one level, right, that's a big jump, right? And we would hope so, right? Students who don't look at content versus those who do. There's a big jump. But after that, right, it kind of tapers off. And those that are above average, actually right here, it actually dips down a little bit in the 75% of use. Right? And frequency relative to peers goes down. The reason why, right? You can think of reasons why. These are all things that we would call conjecture, right? But some students download, they save things, they access them very well and actively. Other students forget where things are and have to go to them a lot. We don't have strong indicators that way, right? But it lets us know, thinking about learning analytics, right? Frequency, just looking at increased use to grade, that's not the relationship we look for. We look for, did they get it at all? And did they access it at all? That's what's the most important thing to look at. Here, I like the grades result my best. I have personal favorites with these, I guess. But this is my second favorite, assessments and assignments. So look at this relationship. Going up to the mean, right? Going up to 50% the quartile of use, their likelihood of getting a good grade goes up. But students who are above average, right, above in the upper quartiles, these upper two quartiles, actually have a bigger likelihood. Their likelihood drops, right? Their grade drops relative to people just spending up to 50% time. And this is assessment, so these are online quizzes. And this one right here is assignments. A less strong curve, but it's still the same. And you think assignments are just reading the instructions and uploading an assignment. And that's all the time we record in those, right? That's all we know, but we get the same we get the same result. Why do you guys think that's true? What do you think what's underlying? These are proxy indicators, so what do you think underlies that? What do you think?
I was just thinking I don't ever want to show this to students. Because the takeaway is don't work too hard.
Ah.
I think the thing you're seeing there is that the people that are good in that class are actually only need to look at the instructions for a short period of time and they know how to do the assignment.
Right.
The ones that are at the bottom of that end are probably struggling to grasp the concept and they're going back and looking at it several times.
That's right.
And then still not getting it before they're severe.
That's what, yeah.
Yeah, or maybe don't waste time agonising about the assignment, just get on and actually do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Procrastination.
Procrastination, yeah. What do you mean by that?
So they're leaving it to the last minute,
Yeah,
and the ones that are rolling are only looking at once.
yeah,
And perhaps the people looking a lot, like you're saying, they're anxious and they're stressed, and they have a little bit of anxiety, and they put a performance card.
right,
Whereas the people in the middle is a sweet spot.
yeah.
The right level of engagement that they've got. Management, stress and anxiety, and perhaps time management.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something that's would be nice to have here, is to have this over time, right? Let's look at this and the behaviors and over time, right? To see how those two are related. We've thought about that, been asked about that, yeah.
Sorry, just one quick question. Is the concept of the due date, does that line up with these graphs? Are any of these late submissions?
We did not look at it by that. We don't see a whole lot of activity after the due date, or it's all right at due date. We've done some recent analysis around that. There's not a whole lot of variability. Some indication of a little bit coming in early, but not much. Like 80%, 90% come in right around the due date. Yeah.
And this is a huge number of courses too, isn't it?
Yes.
It's not- So if you looked at individual courses, see any differences?
Oh, there's huge variation between them. Yeah, there's a substantial variation. And the number, we've begun looking at the number of items in the assessments as well. When we look at courses that have a high number of items to where it's a larger stakes exam or assessment, what usually happens there is that this line goes down here and the red line goes up. So that you'll see that in a second in discussion forums, where they're more intensive items. If you don't put much time into them, you're more likely to fail, right? You're more likely to fail than others. But I think I mentioned this is kind of this fuzzy indicator. That's the next thing. I think looking at this over time, right? Because it is not true that students are working too hard, right? It is that they are, I think, it's likely confused. It's likely they didn't get it. They spent the night before and they're not effective. I think, so how do we understand those behaviors? But right, those are the things where we can make this kind of more actionable and meaningful. But it gets into looking at this data, again, it provides us an understanding of a nonlinear relationship. It's not a direct curve measure of effort, because learning is more complex than that. I'm kind of giving away my punchline. I'll stop. So forums, so discussion forums. So this is just the standard forums. We find them to be not used nearly as often, and we'll talk about why in a minute. You'll notice the size of these bubbles is much lower, so much smaller number of students at these levels. And so here we see that up to the mean, there is a growth in that student grade, and then it tapers off slightly, similar to discussion forums. And again, why? And maybe it's students that are trolling the forums at the very end of the class, right, trying to get something out of it. This is analysis we did afterward, looking at discussions that had a lot of discussion forum activity. I want to say this was at least 60 minutes of forum activity per student, which isn't a real lot, but it sure does filter down quickly. And that's where you see the same relationship of red, right? The red of students, if they're using forums a lot, if you don't use them, you're likely to fail the class, more likely than to pass the class. And you can see there that it trends up at every level, right? It goes up at forums. And we found similar things in other tools, but not as strong as we did in forums. So that kind of more complex analysis is something I think that is very helpful, getting down to the individual course level, right? And looking at this variability within courses. But at every level, it suggests, right? It's not a direct relationship. There's a lot more going on there that we can unpack. So again, one of the things we're doing at Blackboard to incorporate this, and I'm talking too long, I'll go quickly here, that we're creating a recommended grading algorithm. We have created, actually, to provide faculty assistance in grading your forums, because large forums are very difficult to often grade, large numbers of students. So we've taken multivariate, multiple measures that are still surface level indicators, but we can look at things by analyzing text, right, and get something like Flesch-Kincaid, which is a readability score, assigns a grade level. We've got a critical thinking coefficient based on words used. Agree is less critical than disagree, and there's a rubric that we've used and assigned lots of words in the English language to that. And so we're looking at originality of posts, whether a student says something that's different from other students. We put all that and create a score. We're training that on actual faculty grading, so looking at that and training it up. And then we're getting that into and making, again, a recommendation. This is not an auto-grading bot to replace teachers, right? Let's just be clear, right? This is a recommended score for individual students. The way it's being incorporated into Learn is that faculty review every single one before they can post them, and they have the ability to overwrite every single one of them, right? So it's a tool so that you don't spend your time counting the number of words in posts, right? Because we think you've got better things to do with your time, like figure out if they mean something, right? So that's one of the things we have created for Learn in order to help people use forums and grade them more effectively. All right, I'm actually going to skip this part because I do want to get some questions. Happy to share slides. The other thing that's we've looked at, so one of the things is the tools that are used. The other thing is that students don't use tools unless faculty incorporate them into their courses, right? So how could we understand? We wanted to be able to look at the variability of that use by courses. So what we looked at is, right here's the question, is there a systematic way faculty use tools? And do these patterns suggest actions that people could do, or faculty support, academic technologists, to increase the depth of adoption so we can get better student learning taking place? So what we did was we filtered our data the same way I just mentioned for the tool use. And for every course, we identified the amount of time and the number of clicks students spend using tools at the end of the class. So we don't look at what faculty set up or the number of activities. We look at how students spend their time in the course, because we think that's a better indicator. We clustered that, k-means cluster analysis, to look at the results and looked at patterns, and then we referenced those patterns and looked and saw, do they make sense, right? Do these patterns indicate something? And guess what? They did. So to cut to the end, here are 5. This is an archetype, we call it a course archetype. So there are, and we looked at a large number of courses. The first one we called supplemental, and I'll show you the details on each of these in a second, but this is an overview. There's a lot of content in these and not too much of anything else, right? Putting course materials online, low interaction with students. About 53% supplemental goes to complementary, has content, but adds in announcements, grade book, but largely pushing information out at students, not a lot of interaction. That's about 75%, 77. And then the next two, it kind of bifurcates, and this was the really interesting part to me. The one is called social, and that's content heavy, discussion forum heavy tools, I'm sorry. So courses that make heavy use of discussion forums, in addition to content and other things. The other one that kind of, again, that bifurcate there into evaluation, that use assessments a lot. Activities, graded activities, assignments and assessments, and not a lot of some of the other tools. And then at the very bottom, 2% are holistic, that use a whole lot of assessments, content, discussions, a lot of everything. Let me just show you quickly a little slide on each of these. So supplemental, you can see, and this is not raw numbers, this is the percentage of time is what we looked at. So here, right, average class size is 35 students, about 15 hours, 222 interactions. Most of that in course content, but still then gradebook and announcements. Complementary, similar, but smaller sizes, a lot more time. And you can see here there's kind of more balanced use of the tools. A discussion board, assessment, announcements is a big one. But they go up considerably. And then from here we get to, oh, this should have been the forums, but it's evaluative. So this is evaluative. Assessment is almost half of the time spent in that. And here's 38 hours, so we went from 25 to 38. So a lot more time. And then content, gradebook, announcements. Social, and notice the class size drops. Amount of time goes up a little bit, a lot of interactions, and then forums are a really big usage in these courses. And then last and certainly not least, right, our favorite courses, right? I live in, it's holistic, I live in California, right? So it's kind of green, friendly, happy, holistic. It uses a holistic because it uses a lot of tools, right? And if you looked at the actual numbers behind these, the number of time, amount of time spent, it's greater than in the other courses, but as a relative percentage. So a lot of testing, a lot of content, but the other tools are used as well. 70 hours, but the lowest amount of time. I mean, the highest amount of time, highest amount of interactions. And still a 39 students, so a bit higher size. So we looked to validate this, right? We looked at relative time. This shows you something that was not included is the average total amount of time spent. So this is a validation, this density plot. Right here is this, the supplemental courses. So density plot shows, and this is the amount of time spent. And you can see these are largely non-overlapping curves. So when you plot out each of those, and this is a variable not used in the analysis, we looked at time, right? They largely don't overlap, which gives us some confidence those measures are more accurate. The courses that have the least amount, most content, and not other kinds of usage, have the least amount of student time, right? So complementary, supplementary, used it a little bit more. And you'll notice, right, you may remember there was 5 categories, right? 5 categories, but there's only 4 courses. That's because the discussion forum and assessment largely overlap in the amount of time students spent. Those two, so it seemed to be how this kind of bifurcates. And then the holistic has a biggest range, but the peak is still much higher than all of the other courses. Again, so this is something we've taken advantage and we are building into Analytics for Learn, which is what course analytics underlies course analytics, so that not only can you look at your courses in interaction with courses, we have a formula within that that can categorize your courses as which of those types it is based on the relative amount of time students spent, so that if you're looking at tool use, you can look at tool use by the kind of course you have and the way it's being used. You may also want to be in one of those archetypes. Maybe you're seeking, the holistic, or you're looking for something else, and this can help you analyze in your courses. All right, so key implications here. Much of the LMS use is shallow. There's lots of room to increase the adoption. Main ways to think about increasing use that we see faculty doing, right? This is a recommendation based on practice, is more use of assessments, assignments, or discussion forums. Those are largely getting used in smaller classes. That's where they tend to become more used. This third thing I didn't mention too much, and it doesn't come, I don't think it comes across in the graphics, but the usage between those levels is accretive. That is that when people go to the discussion forum heavy courses, they don't stop using content or stop using announcements. They do more. They still have content there. And we welcome campus studies to replicate this. We've had campuses looking at this and help us refine this. All right. I want to take your questions, and we only have a couple of minutes, I think. But these are some of the things we're thinking about. We're looking at these patterns that will lead to stronger predictions rather than overall measures of effect. Natural language processing, semantic analysis, text analysis is something we're looking at a lot as well. I mentioned the forum analysis, and we're increasing that in other areas. and doing much more work to have data-informed features so that designers don't just come up with something brilliant, they come up with something brilliant that's backed by data about what people do. Then we have this, the feedback between usage in the wild, on campus, after things get launched in product development to be able to refine things so they're more meaningful and useful to you. All right, and that, we're close to the end. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
I'm actually, I have a big obnoxious voice, but, sorry. Just a quick question. The advantage of the data you've got seems to be, one of the advantages would be the ability to identify best practice, like the outliers that are just really successful. I'm thinking kind of the discussion forums, which I've had mixed success with, particularly, when I haven't required it. So it'd be great to be able to see, you've got, see who, which classes have high levels of a lot of students spending a lot of time there, and then kind of going, oh, but they're not requiring it. What's going on? And I think, I don't know, is that something you guys do, or you could do, or?
We could do more of. So we do, first, that's a really good point. I think a lot of what we try to do is understand what people are doing now and see what we can use. But it is to move the needle, we need to look at what are the best practices and where is this more effective. We also don't want, so it's an interesting, so we often are looking at what's the central tendency, I think, but maybe the outliers are more powerful. We do that through work that often does case studies, and sometimes those are data informed also, so we look at that, but we often don't integrate that into our work. A little bit with the assessments or this holistic types, we've looked at that, but it's an interesting point that we can balance against present usage. Yeah, thank you for that.
Hey, have you thought about clustering individuals, not just courses?
Yes. We have thought about looking at individuals over time and looking at how that works. The tricky part is that we are largely doing point-in-time research often, but we have found that to be very effective. We have a predictive analytics application called X-Ray for Moodle, and we have looked at patterns over time with students, and we found that to be a pretty strong predictor just in the number of courses taken. So we've begun thinking about that. It gets a little bit trickier to do to identify those patterns and know what students are actually in. That's something, but we've done a little bit of that work.
Are you planning on having archetypes for students as well?
Yeah, we've talked about archetypes for students. We have talked about that. Especially, we've done some research asking students what they think about analytics. And often some of the most high-performing students have been the most critical. But then they turn out to look at them the most. So it's this interesting thing. That wouldn't be true at all. And then they open it every day. But I think their usage patterns may often be quite different because of what we've seen. So yeah, in thinking about where is this low relation, we have talked about doing that. It gets a little difficult to do at scale because we don't have a lot of information about student progression over time. So that's something that we have thought about doing. I think would be just as effective. Yeah, it'd be interesting to do with faculty as well. Let's see a little sensitivity on that. But faculty and course types, there may be some faculty that have found very effective uses and others not, in how those courses cohere to faculty. We find a lot of variation, though, as we've looked at that preliminary.
Just quickly, I work in a faculty that has a very, very mixed demographic of students, and we talk a lot about millennials and non-millennials. So I'm wondering, have you ever looked at the student demographics and interaction, relationship, engagement with, etc., particularly older students?
Yeah, we find greater variation between students within those typical categories, and we find coherence within a pattern. We find the same between programs as well, so we don't find as much as one would expect just because there's so much variation between them. So we've looked at that a little bit. So I recently was talking, people made an argument that, or suggested that we weren't maybe looking at the most important factors. So things like whether a student works, how many children they have, right? These are things that really make a difference in student time, but they're sensitive data points to collect. So it's a little bit difficult to find, but some of those life factors, how those make a difference. And we've been thinking about ways we could ask students more dispositional things, like, you know, how confident are you in your analysis? How good are you, how bad are you feeling about this course? To get some of that feedback in an anonymized way to help break that down, we've been thinking about as well. So to get that more at the student response level rather than those general categories, just there tend to be too much range within them so far.
Yeah, I was interested in the analysis that you did for the forums to, you know, evaluate critical thinking and whatever else. Have you then looked at those across what grades in the courses and to compare whether your evaluation is fitting in with the level of the students across, you know, like if you were tracking that back towards Bloom's and those different criteria for learning?
So is your question, have we looked at how those relate to the level of the course and index?
The students in the grades
Yeah.
to show that, okay, these people are showing, your tool is showing these people having higher levels of critical thinking. Does that then relate back to the grades that those students are achieving?
Yes. So we are looking, so we're tuning the algorithm according to the grade students are achieving and how that works within individual courses. And then we're creating we're not normalizing it. There's a little thought about whether we should enforce a normal distribution or allow faculty to enforce a normal distribution versus something that has a different scale. So we have been looking at that and looking at the strongest correlations that we can find and weighting the different variables depending on how those grades go forward. What we don't know, and what I thought you might have asked, or might be thinking about, so just in case, is how does this relate to the level of the class? That is, students who are in a course that's at the first year should have a much lower level of critical thinking than they do at the most advanced courses, right?
That would be my next question.
Okay. Yeah.
How do you compare across different?
And so far we're not doing that. We're looking at relative distribution between students and something that applies because we do not have the kind of data to get the levels, let alone to have those generalized is quite difficult. So this gives you a sense, and it's surface level data, so a lot of it is originality, it's grade level, it's length, those kind of things, and we do it on a scale within a course, so we hope it gives something better than having to look at all of those. But at the end of the day, so we don't have that degree of that degree of granularity in those, which would be nice. But we don't have access to the data, nor comprehending all systems of higher education, and within that would be a difficult thing. So it's a coarse grained measure.
Thank you, John. One of the things that seems conspicuous in its absence is any data around mobile device access. And given the change in access behaviour of students over the past 10 years is heavily towards mobile, I'm curious what your intentions are for analysing that data, location and platform, I suppose.
Yeah. There's a person at Blackboard that's really happy you asked that question. Leads our mobile team, who's been asking me to get that data. So we have looked at it a little bit, not enough to have something that is meaningful enough yet. One of the things we're finding is that we're finding it conspicuously low, actually. That student use of mobile devices to access courses is much lower, except at peak points, right? Peak points at the beginning of a course when students are getting oriented, and then at the end of the course when they're looking for their grades, seems to be the two peak points in which those devices are used. And then we're seeing a bit of a lower level of use at other points relative to people using browsers. But that was before the launch of the BB Students, now just called Blackboard app, which we have like 2 million downloads of, and it has been instrumented. So we do intend to look at that, and one of the things we really want to look at is is there a group of students, getting back to the student profile, or it wasn't the student clustering question, are there students that are using this, again, a creative? Like, is it that students are using mobile in addition to desktop, or is it a replacement, right? And can we tell these different patterns of usage and whether that's leading to improved student outcomes? And what are they using it for? Who's using it? And what are the outcomes that result? I have a little bit of a hunch that, getting back to some earlier things, that I really want to understand whether it's students who would be successful already are using mobile more to kind of add to their experience, or do we see a group of students who are replacing their usage who might not otherwise have access? Those are some of the things that we've been thinking about and beginning to look into.
Just to add to that, when we look across our Australian clients, the use of mobile is incredibly low. Most of the clients that have analytics for Learn, we have a usage of using mobile apps to access the LMS that is significantly lower, that it's very hard to do any analysis on.
Final question.
Thanks, John. Just a question in regards to course design, which you may not have the data to integrate into your analyses, but looking at, as an academic, I certainly design courses that are purely online. I use Blackboard in a different way to those courses where it's purely a supplemental approach.
Correct.
And whether or not that's actually contributing to potentially some of the absence of relationships that you're seeing in the data.
Yes, I think that's a really big thing that we do not have the data to figure out. So you absolutely are right. When we do modeling and work with institutions that have access to that data, we see that as a much stronger result in relationship. I think that's a very important thing. And that's where we talk about doing follow-on studies with institutions. That's something I would love to take a look at, because that intention of course design, what that level of integration is, really makes a big difference. And we're seeing areas where we can get these predictive results, that is that the usage of the platform has a significant relationship and a higher level relationship with student outcomes, are almost always purely online, because students can get the information other ways otherwise. I had an intern from Stanford University 2 years ago, and still miss him. He's a very good guy. Then Facebook grabbed him. It was quite sad. But he called it necessary. It was necessary and effective use of the LMS, but it had to be something that was necessary that you couldn't get otherwise. That was one of the things he was thinking about. So yeah, and I wish we had that contextual data. That's one of the things that we're not yet able to get access to.
All right, thank you very much, John. Thank you, everyone, for your time here. I'm sure you'll be open for some questions.
Absolutely.
We have the room until 11:30.
Yeah.
So, you're welcome to mingle. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.